Hi, this is Jason Gorman from Codemanship with a sneak preview of an upcoming course on April the 21st at Bletchley Park. It's called Before We Code, Pragmatic Approaches to Business and Requirements Analysis and User Interface Design. It's in aid of Bletchley Park, so every single penny will go directly to the Bletchley Park Trust. It's in a very good cause, and it's a very good course. Follow me on Twitter for updates. So the contents of the course. We start by talking about setting business goals. Don't worry, we're not going to get into the whole enterprisey thing here. You won't have to wear a suit and tie to attend this course. It's going to be very pragmatic, very down to earth, and very grounded in reality, as all of these things will be. Once we've talked about setting business goals, we'll talk about understanding business processes and two techniques that I've used in the past which I found very powerful. The first technique is called tactile modeling, and it's an answer to this problem of analysts trying to use languages like the UML, for example, to communicate with the customer. It just doesn't work because they just don't understand. But when you give them something they can hold in their hands and move around and touch, you can communicate very quickly and very effectively quite complex and nuanced business ideas. So that's tactile modeling. The model office is an idea which I really wish was more widely used, but essentially what we do is we recreate or simulate the business environment on which we're working to understand the business processes, but also it can be used for other things. It can be used, for example, as a very, very powerful, meaningful acceptance testing environment. If you have a model office or a recreated business environment with business scenarios scripted out, deploying your applications into that test environment gives you the kind of feedback that you normally only get when you actually deploy to real users. And finally, test-driven user interface design, which is what we're going to look at now. And then we're going to look at how we tie all of these disciplines together into an evolutionary process so we can learn as we go, keep delivering change into the business to get the maximum value for the minimum effort. So, user interface design. What tends to happen when you work, particularly on web projects, but also on some software projects for desktop and iPhones and all that kind of thing, is you tend to find that teams organize themselves so that the physical design of the user interface comes first, and then we're trying to describe usage scenarios and interaction designs using this physical user interface. So we're presented with a set of wireframes, for example, and then we have to figure out how to make this use case scenario or this acceptance test script work with these wireframes. Now that's the wrong way round. That would be like designing the sets and costumes for your film and then handing them to the screenwriter and saying, write us a screenplay using those sets and costumes, which unfortunately, if you've seen Star Wars Episode 1, is probably how they did that. But that's what you get if you start with the designs and not with the story. The right way around is to start with the story and work your way to the design. So here's an example. We've got a user story. As a punter, I want to place a bet on a horse and see how much money I might win. And we have an acceptance test that we've agreed. Let's imagine this is a fitness test, for example, that we've knocked up with the customer. And it's for a race at Chepstow on June the 3rd, 2011 at 2:30 in the afternoon. And we bet on 3 different horses with different odds, and we place 3 different stakes. And the acceptance test is that the potential winnings for each of those bets should be calculated correctly. These acceptance tests define the start and the end, the beginning and the end of a story or a journey for the user. And the essence of interaction design is to figure out what happens to get the user from the beginning to the end of the story. So we're essentially telling the story through interaction design. I find it really useful because I don't at this stage want to think about a physical user interface or visual design of any kind, to think purely logically about the interaction design. And one way of doing that is to imagine that this is a command line application that we're developing. So we develop a command, place bet, and it has all of these parameters that we need to supply it. Now it will actually do the job. This is a useful, and I use that word very carefully, this is a useful user interface. A useful user interface because it will do the job. It will tell the story, just not very elegantly. And it's going to be a bit of a pain for the user to use because the user's got to remember all sorts of things and do it all in one go. We can improve this interaction design, this logical interaction design, by splitting it up into steps that the user will find easy to remember and that will give the user meaningful feedback with each step. So let's break it down into steps like this. So we start by logging in. We then specify which racetrack we're talking about, and then we specify the date of the race meeting, and then we specify which race we want to bet on, and then we select the horse, and then finally we place our bet for £100. Now, this is a logical interaction design. We could actually write a command line application that does this, but again, it wouldn't be very useful. Users these days are used to visual user interfaces, and at this point we need to be thinking about the characters in our story, so we can go towards character design, the costume design if you like. So who are the characters in the story that we're telling here? So we identify our characters, and there are a few things we need to understand of them. First of all, where are they coming from? The punter is already registered with the system. Chepstow is one of a list of racetracks that are available for us to bet at. The 3rd of June 2011 is one of the available race meets at Chepstow. So we need to understand where this data is coming from, and also understand how it's related. Who are the characters? How are they related? And where are they coming from? Where are they at the start of this story? We also need to understand, as we'll see in a minute, we need to understand how they change during the story, how the story changes them. The only piece of user input here, actually real user input, the only piece of new information is the size of the stake. The stake on the bet is £100. Everything else is information the system already has, and all we're doing is we're selecting it from the system. Okay, once we've identified our characters, it can be useful to sort of map out in a logical sense who these characters are and map out the relationships between them. So this is a map of the characters at the start of this story, and we can then visualize. This is a technique called film strips, where we do, this is an object diagram from UML, but you don't have to use object diagrams, just something along these lines will be dandy. A film strip is just a before and an after, really. So before we place the bet, it looks like this. After we place the bet, it looks like this. We have a bet with a stake of £100 and calculated winnings of 500. So now we know how our story goes. We know how it starts, we know how it ends, we know the steps along the way. We know who the characters are who are involved in the story. We know how these characters are related, and we know where they're coming from, what state they were in at the start of the story, where they were to begin with, and we know how they change as a result of the story, of telling the story. So this is a logical interaction design. This tells us everything we need to know to start designing a real user interface. To make it visual, what we need to do is we need to find visual representations for these characters. So, for example, a picture of me for the punter, the logo of the Chepstow racecourse, the colours of the jockey for the runner, and so on and so forth. So we create a visual language. Now, at this point, we're in territory that is very, very similar to domain-specific languages. Anyone who's extended the UML to create their own visual modeling language using their own custom icons will be familiar with this process. We are defining a visual language, and the next step in user interface design is to tell the story again using this visual language. So we're going to step through the story using these icons or graphics to represent the characters in the story. Okay, so this is like a storyboard in filmmaking. We start off with me logged in as Jason Gorman, just to save a bit of time there. And we're presented with a list of race courses that we can select from. We select Chepstow. And when we've selected Chepstow, we're presented with a calendar with the dates of race meetings at that racecourse. So we want the race meeting on the 3rd of June. So we select the 3rd of June. And then we're presented with a list of races on that day. The race we want to bet on is the one at 14:30, so we select that, and we're presented with a list of the runners. The runner we want to bet on, because we like the look of him, is Jolly Roger at 5-1, so we select Jolly Roger, and we're given the opportunity to place a bet. At this point, we're in a territory called object action. The object that we're actually acting on here is Jolly Roger, and the action is placing a bet. With user interface design, it's always a really good idea to tie the action to the object that it acts on. Okay, so we're entering a bet. We enter our stake of £100, and we submit the bet. That is then saved to our system. This bet is now created with a stake of £100 and calculated winnings of a potential £500 using the iconography that we defined in our previous diagram. So there's obviously a lot more to it than that, and you'd have to come on the course to see the rest of it, but that's the basic idea of a test-driven approach to user interface design, where we basically flesh out a logical interaction model before we start thinking about a physical user interface model. And the best way, I think, to conceptualize it is the way that we make films. You start with a screenplay. Once you've got the screenplay, you then start thinking about the characters, who's involved, and you try to define all this logically, and you bring yourself to a point where you're able to tell the story using a storyboard like this. It doesn't have to be as high fidelity as this. I just did this in PowerPoint because I could. Tell the story using a storyboard, using the visual language that you're created. The shared element of it is the visual language. This is very important, particularly on agile teams where pairs are going off and working on their own features. You need a shared visual language to design your user interface with, and this can be a great way for fleshing that out and sharing that among the team. So, April 21st, before we code, all in aid of Bletchley Park. Jason Gorman is the Twitter ID you need to follow. Thank you.